Manager pays 91-year-old employee with leftovers, regrets it later. He watched from the shadows as she scraped the leftover steak and asparagus into the plastic bag. She went for a plate of mushrooms, looking over both shoulders before shaking the cold food into the bag. With furrowed brows, the man dared to step closer. It wasn't every day a 90-year-old stole from him. Restaurant owner Henry Luc Lenoir hadn't known he'd find an unrecognizable elderly woman taking food from his kitchen when he decided to make a surprise visit that night. He was never one to show up unannounced, knowing that his manager, Hannah Olsen, kept the place in excellent order. But tonight, something urged him to get into his car and drive to the restaurant. It was a cold night when he did so, and Henry had strongly considered not going. His watch read 1 a.m. when he hopped in his car, and swirling black clouds above the dark cityscape promised a night of rain. But despite the hour and the weather, Henry still turned on his car, cut through the night's lazy traffic, and headed for his restaurant. What he'd find would show him he should have done this a while ago. The rain was already dribbling on his windshield when he got to the restaurant. Parking his car a block away, Henry hid under an umbrella so no one would recognize him. The restaurant usually closed at 10 p.m., which gave the night shift cleaners ample time to set things up for the following day. Henry sneaked through the back door, ensuring no one saw him. It was thrilling sneaking through the premises like this, and Henry hoped he'd see his workers in their natural state. He had no idea what he was about to uncover. The cleaning crew was already on site, placing dirty dishes into washers and ensuring the restaurant was sparkling clean. They usually came in at 9 p.m. just as the kitchen staff was winding up with the night's work and prepping the next day's meals. They would send all the leftover foods in containers meant for shelters all over the city, but tonight Henry would discover that not all the leftover food made it to the shelters as planned. Parts of the kitchen were already clean, with the bright light switched off. Henry watched from a dark corner as some of the night crew hurried out of the kitchen, leaving the 90-year-old woman alone. She looked around for a while, her eyes glossy with stemmed tears. With a sigh, she walked to a few dirty dishes that were yet to go into the washer. The first plate she grabbed was halfway filled with ketchup and curly fries. It also had fried mushrooms slathered in what looked like ranch. The woman lifted the plate for a second before setting it aside. It was free of the leftovers when she did so, save for the telltale smear of grease and sauces. But Henry couldn't tell where she'd poured the food. His brows quivered, and he quietly walked to a different corner for a better view. The woman reached for another plate, this one heavy with a steak and asparagus. She pulled a plastic bag from her apron and slipped the food in before looking over her shoulders. Fury erupted inside Henry. How could someone be stealing from him right under his nose? Although Henry inherited the restaurant from his late dad, he'd loved and worked on it as if it was his own. He had expanded the business from a mere diner into a well-known and beloved restaurant, quickly growing it into a must-visit location for many of his city's tourists. As such, he'd poured more than his blood and sweat into the business, building it as a brand and homely place for friends and families to make memories. He was livid when he saw the woman stash food meant for shelters. But instead of confronting her, Henry stayed within the shadows, watching as she reached for another plate. It was loaded with leftover gravy and mashed potatoes, and she wasted no time emptying it into her bag. Seemingly satisfied with what she had, she called a different cleaner who asked her if she was done. She nodded yes, and the cleaner told her he'd finish up. What was happening? The woman walked to a different corner of the kitchen where a large purse was waiting. She hurriedly stuffed the food-filled plastic bag inside and returned to help with the dishes. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager Hannah walked in and told her and the other cleaner to hurry as she was about to close the restaurant. The two nodded in unison and cleared the remaining plates. The elderly woman grabbed her purse and exited the kitchen. As quietly as Henry had entered, he sneaked out after her. He'd never been one to stalk people, especially in the dead of night, but he was keen to know this woman who was bold enough to steal from him. Henry walked a few paces behind the woman who, although advanced in years, didn't need a walking aid to traverse the rainy street. She held her umbrella sturdily as she walked, even impressing Henry. She made her way through different corners to a part of town Henry rarely visited. He saw her disappear into a bus and knew he'd lost her for the night. Henry went back to the restaurant hoping to talk to Hannah, but he found all the doors locked, the place quieter than a cemetery. He could have called her but decided against it. It was already 3 in the morning, a clear indication that even he needed to be in bed. He'd deal with this when the sun came up. Sunrise came up faster than Henry expected, and he drove to the restaurant to speak with Hannah. He'd given her strict instructions on what to do with the restaurant's leftover food and needed to know why a woman he'd never met was stuffing it into a bag at 2 a.m. Henry usually made an effort to know all his workers, even the night crew shift. The fact that he knew nothing about this woman rubbed him in all the wrong ways. He parked his car outside the restaurant and hurried inside, finding Hannah making breakfast and lunch preparations. Hannah, he called her over, motioning to the office where they were meant to discuss the night's occurrence. But just as Hannah was hurrying to him, the elderly woman walked into the restaurant waving at Hannah before heading to the kitchen. Her appearance made Henry hold off from asking Hannah any questions, but it was clear that the woman knew Hannah. Henry didn't understand why she was here so early in the morning, especially after how late she left the previous night. Henry pretended like he'd only come to say hi. He lied that he'd leave the country that night for a few months, so he was here to say goodbye. Hannah's response showed him something was happening behind his back. Hannah seemed too enthusiastic that Henry was leaving the country. She assured him the restaurant was in safe hands. Under different circumstances, Henry would have believed her. She'd proven an asset in many ways, and Henry was glad to have her by his side. But now, with everything happening, he couldn't help but feel apprehensive. He walked through the kitchen saying goodbye to the cooks, servers, and cleaners. His sight scanned the entire place, but he couldn't find the elderly woman. He didn't want it to be evident that he was searching for someone, so he called off his search and quietly walked away. He'd be back in the dead of night. He'd hoped he'd catch the woman in the act, unaware of what he was about to uncover. Henry spent the day searching his worker database for the woman, but he couldn't find her. As far as he was concerned, either the woman didn't work at the restaurant and was stealing food meant for shelters, or she was a recent hire waiting to be processed into the system. Regardless of her case, what she did wasn't good, and Henry needed to stop it. But he had no clue just how deep this rabbit hole went. For Henry, catching this woman was slowly becoming paramount. He even canceled the day's plans and meetings just so he could scour his database. He'd built his family's restaurant on hard work and integrity and had thought each of his workers upheld the same virtues he did. The fact that they were openly letting the woman take leftover food made him feel they didn't care about the restaurant as much as he did. But the more time Henry spent wondering about what had happened the previous night, the more he realized that something was afoot here. First, the other night shift cleaners knew what the woman was doing. One of them even asked her if she was done before they continued cleaning. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Hannah, Henry's right-hand woman and most trusted employee, knew who the woman was. For the past few years, she'd been running new hires by Henry, ensuring he vetted them to see if they were a perfect fit for his team. So why would she hire this woman without bringing it up with him? That morning, the woman had walked by nonchalantly like she'd done it 100 times over. That could mean only one thing. The woman had worked or at least frequented the restaurant several times for her to be as comfortable and friendly as she was that morning. She'd even greeted Hannah, of all people, and hurried into the kitchen as if she was part of the staff. But none of this answered the integral question. Why was she stealing leftover food meant for shelters? Henry spent the afternoon trying to break this case open. He even brought out some of his dad's old restaurant files. Since the woman was advanced in years, perhaps she'd worked with his dad back when the restaurant was still in its infancy. This thought seemed to hold water, given how the old woman was and how much respect she seemed to attract while walking through the dining and kitchen areas. But even this conclusion didn't answer Henry's integral question. The real answer would leave him heartbroken and simultaneously fuming with anger. Henry was quickly concluding that this mystery woman had worked with his dad. His dad was almost in his 90s when he passed, which meant the two were the same age group. If this was the case, then the woman had no business taking leftovers from the kitchen. She deserved way better than that. Henry needed to talk to her and set the record straight. Henry made up his mind that the woman had worked with his dad, but in her advanced years, why was she still cleaning restaurant kitchens at night? Why was she waking up early in the morning to go to work? Didn't she have someone to take care of her? Perhaps she wasn't part of Henry's dad's workforce when he first established the restaurant. Maybe he'd read the situation wrong. With panic setting in, Henry found himself back in square one. The woman wasn't a legacy hire. If so, Hannah would have told Henry. She had to be an imposter stealing food meant for the less fortunate in society. This also meant that she was in cahoots with some workers who were allowing her to take from the restaurant. Slowly and gradually, this anthill of an issue was growing into a mountain, but Henry had no idea how big of a mountain it was. Henry wondered what he'd do when he'd caught her. Would calling the police on a 90-year-old be too much? He took a deep breath as night covered the city, and a slight shower took the dark atmosphere. He only needed to wait a few hours before diving to the restaurant to bust the food thief. Henry was already on his way to the city when the clock hit 1 a.m. He parked his car away from the restaurant as he had the previous night and hurried in. Sneaking into the kitchen, he was glad to find most of the lights off. He stood in the same place he had the previous night, knowing history was about to repeat itself. Like clockwork, the elderly woman entered the kitchen while others were working. She greeted them with a smile and held heartwarming conversations with them. Henry was surprised to find her stories enthralling, and for a moment, he wished to step out of the shadows and talk to her. But there was a lot at stake here. He needed to be strong. Hannah walked into the kitchen, and the other cleaners excused themselves. "Well, hurry up," Hannah told the woman flatly, her hands on her hips. "Despicable," she sneered. Her voice was heavy with disgust and her face contorted. The woman looked away from her, her eyes growing wet, but she wiped them and got to business. Henry watched everything unfold before his eyes. He'd had a hunch that Hannah was in on this. This was his confirmation. The woman packed enough leftovers into her bag and quickly stuffed the plates into the washer. Henry had never seen someone as sad before. This scene melted his anger away, replacing it with a burning curiosity. He needed to know who this woman was. He watched her finish up and turn off the lights as Hannah locked the restaurant's front doors. Henry sneaked out, following the woman through the street, but this time he got on the bus when she did. He kept her in sight, alighting after her on a dark road outside the city. She walked to a trailer park, humming quietly as crickets chirped around her, and distant thunder bawled through the black sky. The woman entered one of the trailers where, after a few minutes, Henry heard the sound of kids talking. There was joy in their young voices as the sound of someone unwrapping plastic paper took the air. After a second, the woman came out, walking to the back of the trailer where she checked a gas pipe before hooking it. But without turning around, she said, "If you're going to do something bad, be done with it. If not, join us for dinner, maybe shelter from this wretched rain." Henry froze. The woman turned around with a smile, and hot guilt fired through Henry. He rubbed his nape, awkwardly taking a step back. "I'm sorry," he said. He just realized the woman had no idea who he was. He turned to leave, but she insisted he stay for a cup of coffee at least. Her voice and smile were soft and welcoming. Her eyes, windows to a soul that had seen all the world had to offer. Henry stepped into the trailer. He watched the woman make him a cup of joe before she started dinner for 4 kids playing with toys in the trailer's living room. None of them looked older than 10. Henry was amazed when she emptied all the food she'd gotten at the restaurant into different containers, making a mini feast for the little ones, Henry and herself. But as she made the food, she also shared information about herself. The woman brought out 3 pots and started cooking. One by one, the restaurant food fell into the hot containers, the aromas making Henry's mouth run wet. He watched the woman make a mini feast for the little kids who had resolved to draw and play in the trailer's living area. But as the woman made the food, she also shared information about herself. The woman's name was Kimberly Harker. She was 91 years old. The kids in her living room were her great-great-grandchildren and the only surviving relatives she had left. Their parents and grandparents passed away a year before in a freak accident, leaving them in the care of Kimberly. Although almost a century old, she had taken them with both arms open. But that wasn't the half of it. Knowing she didn't have much time left on Earth, she'd sold her house and car and put the money in a college fund for all of them. Although too old to get any job, she landed the cleaning position at Henry's restaurant. Henry was dumbfounded to discover she'd been working double shifts for him for 6 months. As part of her wage, Hannah allowed her to take leftovers home. Henry couldn't even speak. He would make Hannah regret the day she decided to go behind his back like this. There was no way he would have allowed this to happen if he knew. How could Hannah hire someone this old, giving her tasks meant for younger people? Did she mean to harm her? Henry thought about his own grandma, grimacing at the thought of her working double shifts for food scraps. He would make Hannah regret the day she decided to go behind his back like this. For now, Henry sat and listened to the woman talk. He sipped his coffee slowly, watching as the woman worked wonders in the kitchen. When she offered him food, he knew he couldn't say no. Everything was so delectable that he knew what he would do as soon as morning came. Leaving the woman's house, he gave her his personal contact, telling her he would be in touch shortly. By morning, Henry had already called a staff meeting at the restaurant. But before the meeting, he called Hannah to the side, telling her to bring all the payment records for the past 6 months. It was then that Henry discovered Hannah's true colors. She'd listed Kimberly as an employee and had allocated a full wage for her, but was paying her in leftover food while pocketing the money. Henry nearly lost his mind. Hannah tried to prove her innocence, but the truth was finally out. Henry discovered that she had several other scams in the restaurant, which ensured she stole from him. But none of what he found surpassed his anger at what she'd done to Kimberly. He'd seen firsthand how cruel she was to the woman. He would make amends on her behalf. The first thing Henry did was find a home for Kimberly and the children under her care. He had a few apartments in town and offered them one that wasn't too far away from the restaurant. As for Kimberly's work, he couldn't have her cleaning dishes and taking food in the deep of the night anymore, but he tasted her cooking and knew he could use her cooking services. Perhaps he could create a Saturday-only special where she'd be the head chef, blessing the restaurant with the decades of experience under her sleeve.